This is the important fulcrum here, that we are inserting in a subsection 3 that regulations made under this section, that's section 105, may prescribe the form of the fixed penalty notice under section 105A and the duties of clerks and the information to be supplied by them. That takes us to clause 4. In clause 4, we are introducing, in the 8 subsections referred there, in subsections, in proposed new sections 105A through H inclusive, we are proposing the introduction of a fixed penalty system. The fixed penalty system is something which is well known to the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. We have fixed penalties under the Dangerous Drugs Act, under the Litter Act, and other pieces of law. We certainly have them in full operation. The one that is most robust and most recent is in fact the motor vehicle and road traffic legislation. We are proposing in clause 4, by the introduction of these new sections to the law that we propose, sections 105A through H inclusive, we are proposing that a regime of fixed penalties can be applied so that there is an alternative route to enforcement for breach of regulations. This alternative route allows for a police officer acting with reasonable cause, obviously, as we see in 105A subsection 2, to visit someone who is breaching with who's potentially in breach of an offense, as we create offenses for breach of regulations, to visit that person with a fixed penalty notice. That policeman would have to issue the notice. Duplicates would have to be sent to the court, to the clerk of the court. We would then have the option for the person to pay or for the person to not pay, as the case may be. There are circumstances painted in the bill which allow for the deeming of the notices. In the event that you have failed to pay within a particular time, you then trigger sections of the Summary Courts Act, in particular sections 42 and 43, where the summons issued is a deemed summons if you have not paid your fixed penalty notice. Effectively, the law then goes in terms of architecture, passing through the particulars of the offense, the manner in which you prescribe what the fixed penalty notice is intended to include, and you'll see that at 105B, the particulars of the charge, the manner in which you can pay for the fixed penalty, the manner in which the amount of the penalty is to be paid and to whom, what happens with non-listing for proceedings, the certificate of payment in the event that you have paid and what is the consequence of that, and then what your consequence of failure includes when you look at 105G. Critically important, 105H introduces the fact that the minister may from time to time by order amend the regulations made under 105 to add an offense to a schedule to the regulations and remove any offense from the schedule or alter the fixed penalty. So let's put down the law for a moment and explain this in simple terms. The Public Health Ordinance allows for the creation of regulations. Regulations allow for offenses to be detailed as to what is an offense or not. We are looking at whether one has a bar in operation, you are found in a public place such as a beach, which is currently limited, you're in a casino, or you're wearing a mask. The regulations may prescribe any number of events. Instead of being confined only under section 105.3 to an arrestable offense with a maximum of $50,000 and 6 months, you now have the alternative of a policeman saying, if these regulations specify what is to be treated as a fixed penalty, that the policeman will say, the regulations have a schedule. In that schedule, for instance, mask wearing is treated by way of a fixed penalty notice. Those regulations now state what your penalty for failing to wear a mask, by way of example, will be. And the intention of the government is to issue these regulations with a schedule by which we immediately prescribe fixed penalty notices, administrative route, with charges identified in law. And what is it that we propose? The regulations, once issued in the normal fashion, in the process I've defined previously, will now prescribe, by way of publication, that failure to wear a mask in a public place, with certain exceptions, for instance, with respect to age or medical condition or physical disability, or in public circumstances advised by the CMO through guidelines providing for exceptions, that failure to wear a mask, for instance, will attract, by way of first offense, $1,000 in respect of the breach, by way of second offense to $2,000, and by way of third offense to $5,000. After that, you are looking instead to the arrestable offenses. And Madam Speaker, in constructing the formula for fixed penalty notices in the parent law, we allow, importantly, for more matters to be regulated by way of fixed penalty. For instance, if one contemplates the need for a self-quarantine provision, where the CMO advises the Minister of Health and the Cabinet that it is appropriate to move to the stage of self-quarantine, you now have the ability to issue fixed penalty notices for breaches of self-quarantine as opposed to arrestable offenses. It is for that reason that we have sought to amend the maximum ceiling, as you see in Clause 3 of the bill, moving it from $50,000 and 6 months to $250,000 and 6 months. So the bill allows for, quite simply put, a formula for fixed penalty regime. That formula is to be applied by way of regulations. Regulations can be adjusted dynamically and from time to time in the fashion of the Cabinet going to work to promulgate and produce these regulations. The regulations will specify what the sum is and what it can be in multiple circumstances, for instance, by way of first offense, second offense, third offense, etc. It also then allows for easy variation of those sums by way of an order to amend the schedule to the regulation. Madam Speaker, when one drafts law, one must contemplate the law standing for all time. So this law is not drafted simply for mask wearing. It is a formula to allow for a number of events to be done by way of fixed penalty notice. And it also allows for variation. For instance, if the severity demonstrates that it is no longer suitable to cause compliance by way of fixed penalty notices, you can revert to arrestable offenses and treat with more serious charge. Let me assure honourable members that there are multiple precedents in our own law as to a fixed penalty regime. Very importantly, this bill allows, Madam Speaker, for the clerk of the district to receive payments, and that you can receive payments actually at the district. I want to remind that we no longer have 12 magisterial districts. We now have 3 magisterial districts. Port of Spain, North, all of North, including Port of Spain and down to basically Central, called the North District, South, and Tobago. There are only 3 districts. Because importantly, Madam Speaker, we allow for the payment of penalties, and you'll see that 105C subsection 2, we also allow for penalties by way of electronic payments into an out-of-court act in 2018. In other words, then, you can pay outside of the court using electronic payments, as we do currently for a number of services, including the motor vehicle and road traffic demerit point system and fixed penalty system, which is actively in operation as we speak. It was so proclaimed and put into effect on the 26th of May, 2020. So there's a very robust system of multiple opportunities for satisfaction of the law. This law preserves the right of appeal. This law preserves the fact that you can pay a penalty and still appeal, that you are not estopped or bound in any form of acquiescence, if we use the civil comparators, to the fact that you've paid the penalty and therefore you've denied yourself the right of appeal. And that, Madam Speaker, can be found in Clause 4 of the bill, where you still have the ability, notwithstanding payment, to be deemed to have preserved your right of appeal. That is to be found at page 2 in subsection 6 of Clause 4 in reference to new proposed section 105A as an alpha. Madam Speaker, we allow as well a certain amount of privilege for movement. The question is always, can law change society? The question is obviously going to be, well, how does one propose the limits? Let me remind that for a seatbelt offense, you're looking at $2,000. In a situation for failure to wear a seatbelt, you may hurt yourself or a limited number of people in a car accident. But in the case of the COVID pandemic, failure to wear a mask, by way of example, or to obey a self-quarantine outside of the provisions of the Quarantine Act and instead relying on the public health ordinance for quarantine purposes, you are looking at the potential to infect hundreds, if not thousands of people on an exponential factor, and more particularly, you are dealing with the situation of death being the risk, especially to the most vulnerable in society. Madam Speaker, we do propose to circulate those very small amendments at committee stage to correct the inadvertent reference in clause 3 of the bill to subsection 2, changing to subsection 3. I look forward to contributions coming from honourable members. Of course, the government is willing to listen to the proposals put forward. I want to remind that we are not debating any regulation for mask wearing today. We are simply creating in the parent law the springboard to use an administrative formula of fixed penalties, an alternative to treating with the offences for breach of regulations, that alternative being a second route which doesn't compel you to arrest someone, take them down to the police station, arrange bail at station or in the magistrate's court, etc. So, Madam Speaker, I certainly look forward to the contributions across the floor with the hope that we will get to committee stage quite quickly, and I beg to move.
Honourable members, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, to make provision for fixed penalties and fixed penalty notices for offences under the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, be now read a second time. Member for Barataria Sangha.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for recognizing me to join in this debate in this august chamber. And just like the Attorney General, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate all members of Parliament in the recently concluded general elections of 2020. And standing here, Madam President, as the youngest member of Parliament in this 12th Parliament, I want to pay special tribute to the member of Superior for allowing the youths an opportunity to have a place and a space in this Parliament to represent the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, I'd also like to thank the constituents of Barataria San Juan. Madam Speaker, sorry, I'm accustomed to another house. But Madam Speaker, I would like to thank the constituents of Barataria San Juan who has reposed their confidence and support in me in allowing me to win this particular seat in this Parliament. Now, the Attorney General didn't indicate that historically that this is something quite extraordinary, that we are sitting right after a ceremonial opening of Parliament to debate a particular piece of legislation. And this comes on the heel, Madam President, that the world is facing the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is true that the government and the citizens of this country have to take certain measures and steps in order to protect themselves and to ensure the health and safety of everyone. Because this, Madam President, is one of, Madam Speaker, this is one of the deadly diseases that we are facing right now. And before I began my research, I looked at what the Ministry of Health would have posted through their media release. And as of today, this morning, there were 22,792 samples submitted to CAFA, Of those samples, 1,512 would have tested positive, 867 active cases, 17 deaths. 2 persons would have died today, and I express my condolences to them on behalf of the opposition. And 628 persons have been discharged. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that we have to act swiftly, we have to act certainly, and we must act effectively in order to curb the further spread of this deadly virus on our population. Now, we have seen earlier on that the government took certain strong measures, in fact, to curb the spread of the deadly virus. But recently we have seen that the cases have exploded. And Madam President, that is something that we have to explore in detail. Now, this debate strictly deals with respect to the regulations, the enforcement of the regulations, and the administration of the regulations made under the Public Health Ordinance. Now, we on this side, our duty is to ensure that we fight this virus, that we protect the safety and health of our citizens. And yes, the opposition leader did in fact indicate that we will be supporting the legislation with respect to the wearing of face masks. But we have to look at the details in the bill. And that is why we are here in this parliament. Because when you look at the bill that is presented before this particular house, we have identified certain issues. And the population is looking on at us right now, Madam President. And it is said, Madam Speaker, and it is said, Madam Speaker, that this bill that we're debating today deals with the wearing of face masks. So everyone, including members of this House, before we saw the bill, the population has been looking out for a piece of legislation that dealt with making face masks mandatory. Now, I was surprised by the Attorney General's statement that, in fact, that this bill doesn't deal with that, and none of the provisions of the bill deals with that. And that is something that we have to look at, because you came with haste, you said that we have to pass this bill, but the members of this particular House, Madam President, we deserve some more respect. At least provide us with the draft regulations. Provide us with the draft regulations for what we are going to enforce. So we are setting up an entire system to enforce regulations, Madam President, in the courthouse. But we don't know what we are going to enforce. You know, many persons in the population are asking whether or not the wearing of a face mask, the mandatory wearing of a face mask, whether they have to wear it in their cars, whether persons of a certain age have to wear it, whether there would be any exceptions. We don't know none of that because the government, again, has not done their job to provide us with that information. And we thought that coming from the 11th Parliament to the 12th, that the Attorney General may have acted with a little more competency in this particular Parliament. Now, Madam President, you are asking us for our support. You are asking us for our support in this particular legislation, but at the end of the day, we are left without any information. Now, this is on the heels of the fact that I have, as a matter of public record, the Prime Minister of this country saying that there is no point in making a law that can't be enforced when he spoke of the wearing of face masks. This is Loop TT, Madam President, on the 30th of May 2020, where the member for Diego Martin West did in fact say that why are we going to create a law for people to wear masks if we can't enforce it? So now you're bringing a bill that deals with the entire enforcement of wearing face masks and also other regulations made under the Public Health Ordinance. But the Prime Minister has had a different view from now. What change of view? The Attorney General did not indicate to us how, in fact, for example, they are going to enforce the mandatory wearing of face masks, 1. 2, any other offenses created under the regulation. And 3, Madam President, whether or not the judiciary, the courts, are in a state to administer this. Because as I know, there are many courts, district courts, being shut down right now in the country Madam Speaker, they are being shut down in the country because there are positive cases of COVID-19 in some of those courts. But yet you are encouraging persons to come to the court to pay a fine, to pay a ticket. Now, this, Madam President, must be dealt with holistically. You have to indicate us whether or not this particular piece of legislation will in fact be enforced, or whether or not we are coming here as a PR game for the government in its fight against COVID. And I think we need answers to that. But in fact, it was the United National Congress, the UNC, since April 2020, that has called for the wearing of face masks to be made mandatory. Because this is when the Center for Disease Control and the United States made recommendations that this can help curb the spread of the virus. But then you come for us in this parliament to say, okay, let's make face masks mandatory, but the population doesn't know what face mask to wear, which one to wear, whether you could put a bandana on your face and still comply with the law. At Jersey, I know the Minister of Health, Madam President, the member for St. Joseph, is busy making masks with old jerseys. So then most of us will remember also, we will remember that there was a tender for $5 million being issued in this country for wearing face masks. I don't know how many masks the government gave out, but I can tell you on this side, we gave out over 60,000 free face masks. That is what we did. So, Madam President, when it comes to this, Madam Speaker, sorry, I do apologize. When it comes to this issue with respect to this particular piece of legislation, we have to look at the efficacy and the efficiency. We have to see, in fact, whether or not what we do in this parliament is going to achieve the legislative aim. Because that is what you have to do. When you're looking at making laws in a country, there must be a policy. And then you have the laws to enforce the policy. And whether or not this law will, in fact, achieve the legislative aim. So that's the first prong. Now, there are benefits with respect to what is being proposed here by the Attorney General in this bill in terms of fixed penalty. And the benefits are because it applies to other laws. We will be accustomed, many of us, if you have received a ticket for a motor vehicle offense, that the police officer will issue the ticket, then afterwards you go to the court, you either pay the ticket, or if you don't pay the ticket, a date will be set for you to appear before the magistrate, and then the matter will be proceeding as a regular summary court offense. Now, this is exactly what is being proposed in this bill. There's no difference from that in terms of how it proceeds. But we have some issues, Madam Speaker, through you to the Attorney General, in terms of some of the particular issues as it relates to the administration of these fixed penalty notices. Now, I want to just go on to clause 4.6. Attorney General, you touched on this very early in your proceeding, in your presentation. And that deals with the appeal. Now, there's no, I stand to be corrected, I don't know any other particular piece of legislation that there is an appeal to a magistrate. Now, subsection 6 of clause 4 reads, notwithstanding any provision of this act or any written law to the contrary, a person who pays a fixed penalty before the expiration of the time specified for the payment thereof may, in the prescribed form, appeal to the magistrate in the district in which he paid the fixed penalty in respect of the offense for which he was charged. Now, the issue with respect to this is that you are dissuading persons from coming to court, but you're asking them to pay the fine and then come back to the court and challenge the ticket. And then when you read on to subclause 10G, 105G, sorry, you see that if you don't pay the ticket, then in fact a date will be set for the hearing. So yes, we understand that there are two ways out of this thing. Either you pay the ticket, and within the time, you appeal the decision. Or appeal the fact that you paid, because there's no decision. Or the second thing is that you don't pay the fine, but you appear on the date given to you in the fixed penalty notice, which is the ticket. So we are trying to understand that procedure of an appeal for the payment of a fine. That a lot of persons, I can tell you, will in fact take advantage of this. They will pay the ticket, and if the time comes, before the time elapses, they will then challenge it on the appeal, and therefore what we do, we clog back up the judiciary, the same system you're trying to free up. So we have to see whether or not we are engaging in legislative insanity. Because you have to understand, firstly, whether or not your policy is to free up the court system, make COVID charges a little more efficient, but yet you are creating an additional level of bureaucracy. So, Madam Speaker, this is one of the issues I would like to raise. And in the committee stage, we can probably look at suggesting some amendments to having this in a more palatable manner in terms of how we move forward with respect to this issue of an appeal. Because I know the member for Port of Spain South also practices criminal law, and I don't know if you can point us to anywhere in the criminal law or any law that there's an appeal to a magistrate. That is something that is very strange and very unique. Now, when you look at subclause 7, on the same exact issue with respect to the payment of the fine. So you challenge the fact that you paid the ticket, and then the magistrate rules in your favor. When the magistrate rules in your favor, this is assuming you will be now refunded the money that you paid. Now, there are decisions of the High Court that in fact says that this money will attract an interest payment. Now, is the administration of this particular piece of legislation contemplating that decision where in fact interest has to be paid on the refund of the ticket? Now, that will create an additional burden to the state, Madam Speaker, through you to the Attorney General. So this is something you have to really think about in terms of whether or not we want to enforce this, because you will create a lot of administrative bureaucracies when it comes to this and challenges with respect to this particular piece of legislation. That is one of the issues in terms of the appeal. Now, there's another issue that deals with Clause 105H, Madam President, of the bill. Now, this clause is very objectionable because what it does, it gives the Minister of Health far-reaching and wide powers. Now, under the Public Health Ordinance, the Attorney General did in fact say how long this legislation was passed, the antiquity of the legislation. So this is a colonial piece of legislation that we are applying in today. Now, Trinidad and Tobago has progressed in terms of our democracy. The Minister, through these regulations, have been creating offenses, Madam Speaker, and these offenses that he have created have no Parliament oversight or no Parliament scrutiny. There are actually no checks and balances in terms of the regulation. Every week you open an email and you will see a new legal notice with some new regulations, with some new offenses being created. And the Parliament is not getting an opportunity through this ordinance in order to really give its approval in terms of how or whether or not we approve or disapprove of some of the measures that are being placed by the government. Now, we are suggesting, Madam President, that this clause that is being inserted in this bill, 105H, also gives the Minister that far-reaching and wide discretion and power without any Parliament oversight or scrutiny. Because this is what the Minister can do. The Minister can add any offense to the schedule in the regulations. So I'm assuming, without seeing the regulations, that there will be some schedule as part of that regulation that specifies the offense, and it will specify the fine that is going to be imposed. Now, the Minister has the power to fine someone who breaches a COVID regulation up to $20,000. $20,000. This, again, is showing you the power being given by the executive without any check or balance on executive power being exercised by a minister. So this is something we have trouble with placing our approval on in terms of the powers being given by a minister. It's something that we could discuss at length in the committee stage again, in terms of making something a bit, again, more palatable, so that this regulation can stand constitutional scrutiny also. Because I can give you an example. If the government gazettes the regulations in the morning and says, well, look, you have to wear a face mask if you go into a public place, as even a supermarket, then the minister, by the stroke of a pen, can say, well, we can fine this person $20,000. Now, someone in this pandemic who can't even buy groceries to survive, I know the member for Laventille West was buying some groceries for some person recently. He was energized, and he was buying some groceries for some needy family. And there are so many needy families in this country, Madam President, who would not have been able to access the grants, the COVID grants in terms of the salary relief. And now you're going to place this additional burden on them and charge them $20,000. So you have to look at whether or not the population can bear this additional burden. Now, we understand the fact that persons have to act responsibly, and this can be a deterrent. But what we are suggesting on this side is that there be some level of accountability and Parliament oversight when you are going to pass draconian legislation such as this, empowering one person in the executive who is the Minister of Health, giving him all this power by the stroke of a pen. Because the minister can add any offense. He can prescribe the penalty for that offense, and he can also remove the offense. Now, there's also a bit of inconsistency in the legislation when it comes to the maximum fine. Now, the Attorney General could give us some clarification on this when he winds up. Is that the minister has the power to prescribe fines up to $20,000. But when you look at Clause 3 of the bill, it creates a maximum fine of $250,000. So is it that some offenses in the regulations will be under the fixed penalty notice, where the maximum fine will be $20,000, and others will now incur something higher than the $20,000? So that is one point of clarification in terms of the difference in the maximum penalties as prescribed in this particular piece of legislation. So we are objecting, Madam President, to the fact that the minister has so much power and being able to impose such draconian measures on the population. Now, we have to also look at the time limit being given by the government for a person to pay a fine. And the time limit is prescribed at 105C at subclause 6, where it reads that the time within the fixed penalty is payable shall be 14 days or such other period as prescribed by the rules of court. So, Madam President, you're asking someone to fine, if there's an offense that carries a penalty of $20,000, to fine $20,000 in 14 days in order to pay this penalty. Otherwise, they will in fact go before a magistrate, and there is also a sentence of imprisonment that can be imposed on that person who allegedly would have breached the COVID regulations. Now, there are other countries in the world, Madam President, who have, in fact, implemented this fixed penalty system. And one of those countries is the United Kingdom. I know Grenada, St. Kitts, they also have legislation dealing with the mandatory wearing of face masks. With respect to the UK, Madam President, Ireland, Madam Speaker, sorry, North Carolina, California, and the United States, these are all countries that in fact have fixed penalty systems for COVID guidelines and COVID regulations. And they have all experienced some level of difficulty when it comes to the enforcement of these particular regulations. And that is something that we must learn from the experience. We can't just come and say, this will in fact be the fix for it, this will ensure that persons pay fines, this will ensure that persons comply with the regulations. You have to look at the experience in terms of how this thing was administered and enforced, because there's one particular barrister in the United Kingdom, Pippa, I believe. She indicated that the police was in fact abusing their authority under the legislation in terms of issuing tickets, and that most of those matters that were filed in court are actually under review right now to determine whether or not there have been some level of police misbehavior involved in terms of the enforcement of these regulations. Now, Madam President, all of these issues, suffices to say, is that we want to ensure that we assist the government in creating better legislation for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. This is to ensure that at the end of the day, we assist in terms of making sure that these fixed penalties work better, that they're administered in a more efficient way, that they enforce properly, so that we can stop the spread of this deadly virus throughout the population. So while I may raise issues when it comes to the bill, this is to ensure that we don't allow this parliament to become a rubber stamp. It is to ensure that the opposition has a voice, a space, and a place to assist the population to protect themselves from this deadly virus. Now, Madam President, there are so many other issues where we can raise when it comes to these particular regulations. And my colleagues would in fact raise most of them. But when it comes to this power being given here, Madam President, to the Minister, I would stop at that point in terms of there are other points to be raised in that circumstance. Now, I want to go back to the point with respect to the mandatory wearing of face masks and how other jurisdictions would have dealt with it. Now, there's one particular part of the bill that deals with the standard in which the police officer has to satisfy himself of in terms of before he enforces the regulation. And I see that the Attorney General did in fact in the bill draft to read, and this is found at clause 105A sub 2, where it says that where a police officer has reason to believe that he's committed or has committed an offense under section 105. Now, I know from other bills that we have drafted, this can be a simple drafting issue in terms of whether or not it should read reasons to believe or whether or not the police reasonably believed. Because I don't want it to be interpreted as there's an inconsistent standard in terms of what the magistrate has to satisfy themselves of when it comes to the deliberation of the offense before the court. So that can be cleared up in the drafting part and the committee stage of this bill, Madam President. The other part deals with the exceptions, and I hope that the Attorney General in the winding up, because the population is anxious to hear what are the exceptions and the circumstances for the mandatory wearing of face masks. These are some of the issues, Madam President, that at this time I would wish to raise, because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that we can return to a level of normalcy so that our economy can in fact become a better place. Because as we said before, that COVID really didn't destroy the economy. It's really the government that in fact did that. So these are some of the issues, Madam President, at this time I wish to raise. On this side, we are going to ensure that this opposition, that we will support good law and good legislation. And in this particular instance, Madam President, we will try our best to fix this piece of law that has several defects of which I have outlined. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
Honourable members, this is the maiden contribution by the member Bartara Sanwan in this House. I want to commend him. I recognize that he does have a little difficulty in reincarnating himself, but I'm certain he will appreciate where he is given a couple more days. The member for Faizabad.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for recognizing me and for the opportunity to contribute on what I believe is a very important and critical piece of legislation, namely an act to amend the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, to make provision for fixed penalties and fixed penalty notices under the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4. Before I proceed, I just wanted to congratulate all members on their victory at the recent polls, and to say a special welcome, especially to the new faces joining us here today. I also would like to thank the constituents of Faizabad who have shown their faith in allowing me to represent them for a second term in this Parliament, and I expect to do even more for them under the expert guidance and supervision and the leadership of the esteemed member for Siparia, the Honorable Kamala Prasad Mithani. Madam Speaker, we are indeed in very different times. The mere fact that we are standing in this Parliament here wearing masks to make our contributions, and the fact that earlier our speaking time has been cut, gives us an idea, of the severity of the times that we are in. As we would have mentioned on our side, we have no difficulty in supporting the idea of mandatory masks. In fact, if we look at the situation, there are more than 50 countries, and the numbers are climbing, where you've had the legislation for the mandatory wearing of masks. Before I move on, of course, I also want to thank my colleague for his maiden contribution in the House, Member for Barataria San Juan, and for raising some very important points, a few of which I just want to add and to build on. I am a little bit disappointed in terms of the legislation. It was said that, okay, we're going to debate mandatory mask wearing today in the Parliament, and therefore I expected that perhaps in his piloting of the bill, the Honorable Attorney General would have given some indication of what is intended. But nevertheless, looking at the creation of the offense with regards to 105 clause 5, which adds 105H, where the offense is to be created for masks. I just want to add a few points with regards to that. Madam Speaker, again, before I go further, and I know that the numbers are increasing. We are over 1,600 cases, and unfortunately we have risen to 17 deaths. This is a situation which is escalating, and therefore it is a cause for concern. So before I go further, I just want you to permit me to thank all of the frontline workers who have bravely battled this potentially deadly virus, and who continue to do so despite many challenges that they face in the health sector. And of course, these are the doctors, the nurses, the attendants, the ambulance drivers, the laboratory staff, the administrative staff, members of the protective services, those brave men and women who guard our borders. I think it's also important, especially when we are attempting to pass legislation such as this. And we can legislate, but as mentioned earlier, you can't always legislate for a change of behavior. So I think it's very important that we recognize the role that the public has played in all of this scenario since the lockdown in March. And I want to commend the members of the public for doing whatever they could have done in these circumstances to protect themselves and their family and the society at large. So I think that's important. And I say this because going forward, regardless of what we do here this afternoon in the Parliament, going forward, they will require some level of cooperation from the public. And I think this is very important, that we accept and understand this, because making the wearing of masks mandatory is a sort of nebulous issue. I mean, yes, there are things we can define by law, but there will be many nebulous areas. And for example, the Attorney General mentioned that a police officer will go to find someone, find, F-I-N-D. The question really is, how is the offense going to be committed? Is it that someone walking on the street without a mask is going to be accosted by a police officer and a fixed penalty? So I think these things need explanation. Or is it that somebody will report that somebody was not wearing a mask, and then the police officer can go to their home to charge them? So I think there's obviously quite a bit of clarification required here, Madam Speaker. This whole issue, is very ironical, because we've reached a place in the world. In my research, up to 2013, just a few years ago, there was legislation passed for people not to wear masks for various reasons and so on. And now we've reached the point where, of course, we are passing legislation for people to wear masks, mandatory. And I agree with that. The WHO would have issued that edict on the 6th of June. And as I said, there are over 50 countries which are now following suit, and the numbers of countries are rapidly increasing. In fact, today, as we speak, right now, in Paris, it is mandatory for you to wear masks in public spaces. Previous to that, it was mandatory to wear indoors if you're in an indoor facility. Now, as we speak, 5 hours ahead of us in Paris, it's now the law that you have to wear masks in a public space. Very interesting as well, I read about the situation in California in the USA, where a public health official had implemented on her own, as part of a regulation, similar to what we have here, the public health ordinance. She had implemented by regulation the mandatory wearing of masks, and she encountered a situation where various threats were made to her life, and she had to withdraw the regulation, and then it was left up to the governor of California to implement that regulation. So I'm just saying that because obviously there's a lot of controversy, but I'm also saying that I agree fully, we on this side fully agree, that it should be, mask wearing should be mandatory, and it's very important. But we're just here to ensure that whatever regulations are made properly, are made to protect those who need to be protected, and that it is fair and equitable. I will just make a few points, and I just wanted to mention a little bit about the issue of home quarantine, because I understand the principle that is being used here. Instead of specifying masks in the legislation, we are saying that you're changing the law in such a way that if other things become an issue, they can be dealt with. I understand that principle. The issue of home quarantine came up because now the government, by recent change of policy, has decided, because of numbers and so on, that the patients will now be discharged from the step-down facilities and they will be quarantined at home under supervision. And of course, that situation needs to be monitored very closely, needs to be policed very closely, because you're looking at a situation where previously these persons, I don't want to call them patients because many of them would have been asymptomatic. You're looking at a situation where previously these persons would have had to remain in a facility for at least 14 days, have 2 negative COVID tests done and so on. Now that has changed, and I understand why it has changed. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do, but that has changed, and therefore, again, when the regulations are made, it's important for the public to know exactly what is involved, the fines and so on, what would be the conditions for home quarantine and self-quarantine. So I just want to throw that up front. I think it's important for the public in the public domain. This situation is just maybe about 2 or 3 years old. Perhaps the Minister of Health would be able to tell us a bit more about that, but I just threw that out. But I throw that out also, Madam Speaker, because there are also some other issues that we need to look at and to consider. Because although it's a good move, although it will free up the resources for those who are really sick and need the facilities, excuse me, it will also present a situation where now many more patients, many more persons may turn up at facilities for testing. Previously, many would have avoided testing simply for the reason that if they tested positive, they were bound at that point in time to stay in a facility. So I'm just saying that now that might create a situation where there might be an increased demand for testing, and therefore the government needs to be aware of this and to be prepared to deal with that if that comes along. And of course, there will be the issue of the government's plans to, what would be the plans to use the step-down facilities and so on in terms of resource allocation and reallocation of resources. I just want to make a few points about the mask. Madam Speaker, now the whole issue of face masks, one of the issues of face masks, and I think it's important, we're debating in the Parliament, and I'm sure members of the public are looking on closely at the debate. And one of the issues, of course, has to do with the definition of the mask, whether there's going to be a definition of what constitutes a mask. The other issue would be the quality. There are interestingly no legal standards for masks. We are talking about cloth masks as opposed to medical masks. So interestingly, there are no legal standards. So I'm just throwing that out. And I just want to make it, in terms of the public health issue of wearing the masks, one of the common things I see with mask wearing is that people have on a mask. I think it's important that it's made clear that the mask should be covering your nose and your mouth. One of the common things I see is people have on a mask, but the mask is down by their chin, Madam Speaker. And that is worse than not wearing a mask at all. Because what you're doing is you're taking, potentially, the bugs that can be on your chin, and when you put back on the mask, you take it up to your face and your nose. So I think that's important. So it's important that when the legislation rolls out, it is made very clear that the mask should be covering your nose and your mouth. And just having a mask on your chin is not sufficient or good enough. I think the issue of exemptions is very important, Madam Speaker. For example, it needs to be clarified as to whether someone who is exempted will require a doctor's letter, for example. And going forward, someone will have to work with that to be exempted. The exemption with regards to age is very interesting. Madam Speaker, I assure you this is not a COVID cough. It's because the chamber has turned a little bit hot and I have on the mask, so that triggers the allergy. So.
Because while you're giving us advice, I do recall one of the things that have been said, if you show symptoms, you stay at home.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and that's why I took front before you stood up. So the issue of age, the exception for age, and again I throw this out, Minister of Health, because if you peruse the legislation for all of the states in the US of A, just taking the US of A, you will find that there are different states. For example, some will say those under 2 are exempted, those under 5 are exempted, those under 7 are exempted. So again, it's something that we should consider going forward. The other issues that we should look at with regards to exemption is the issue of the hearing impaired, for example. If someone is hearing impaired, normally they would, you're looking at the sign language, so we have to make, provisions for them. What about the issue of prisoners and wearing of masks in the prisons? This is something that I saw came up, in some of my research and so on. So that's something that perhaps the AG may want to look at, whether those would be a case for an exemption or not. Because you have everyone wearing the same uniform in prison. With a mask, it might be difficult to know who's missing, who is not missing. Now, the fines that the AG outlined with regards to not wearing a mask, increasing first 1,000, second offense 2,000, third offense 5,000. Question really becomes now what happens after the third offense? Is there a provision for that? And I say that because in the UK, for example, you have a similar system where the first offense is £100, but then you go up to a ceiling of £3,200. So I'm presuming that based on the legislation, that the $20,000 might be the upper limit. But again, that would need to be clarified for repeated offenses. Of course, it was mentioned before, and again, I just want to emphasize in regarding to the issue of policing this offense when it's created. I think that's a very nebulous area. It's something that needs to be clarified. I'm presuming that discussions would have taken place between the government and the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service with regards to the training of officers and creating awareness and so on amongst police officers as to what the offense will be and how it's going to be, how this ticket is going to be issued. And of course, it's very important if you meet someone on the street, if the officer meets somebody on the street who is not wearing a mask, and you want to ticket that person, how do you identify the person? Is it that people are now going to have to walk with their identification, with their IDs on them? I think that's important to take into consideration. So, Madam Speaker, we are in principle here to support the mandatory wearing of masks. We are here to support this legislation. We are just asking that these issues be treated with in a manner that will, create transparency and so that everyone knows what they're about. And of course, I'm trusting that perhaps in the committee stage or perhaps if another member of the government contributes, that we'll get more clarification with regards to these issues. So as I close my short contribution, Madam Speaker, I just want to make a call to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago and implore them to make sure and hand sanitize, to make sure and social distance, and please wear your mask. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As I rise to make my first contribution in this new session of the Parliament, I would like to thank, first of all, the good people of St. Joseph for reposing their confidence in me for a third term, and in the People's National Movement. And to thank my Prime Minister for giving me a second stint as Minister of Health. And I think I end at 3:01, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, during the Christmas vacation of last year, of 2019, I would have started to see popping up in the international news this strange new phenomenon coming out of China about strange X-rays and this new type of pneumonia. At that time, we had no name for it. At that time, we did not know what to expect. And I remember coming out to work on the 2nd of January and meeting with the chief medical officer then. And what is going on here? Nobody knew at the time. But slowly, this thing started to evolve out of Wuhan, China, into other parts of China, into other areas around the Pacific. And 8 months later, here we are, in the beginning of a global pandemic, because that is where we are now. We are in this for the long haul. There is no magic bullet, there is no vaccine, there is no standardized treatment. Madam Speaker, the world is fighting an invisible, odorless, colorless enemy, where 100,000 units of that virus could fit in the diameter of a human hair. That is how small it is. Let me repeat that. 100,000 pieces or viral entities can fit on a human hair, on the diameter of a human hair. That is how small it is. Not the length, the diameter. If you cut it, the diameter, like on a pinhead. Cross-section. So, Madam Speaker, this is what we are faced with. We are here today to debate a piece of legislation that is going to help us save lives, save economy, save jobs, make workplace safer, and help with source control. That is what we are here about. The virus can enter our bodies through 3 main channels in ascending order of importance. The eyes being the least important, the mouth, and very often the nose, the nasal passages. What the world is aiming for right now as far as mask wearing is concerned, we would like 100%. In other words, we would like everybody to be wearing masks. But we know we can't get there. And all the research suggests that any population that could get up to about 70, 80% could be in a very good place as far as deaths are concerned. But wearing masks alone have to be taken in the context of other public health measures, such as hand sanitization, the physical distancing, staying home if you are ill, coughing into the crook of your hand and elbow, and so on. I want to respond to my colleague from Barataria, Sanborn, and in the spirit of a new parliament, I use the word chastise the Honorable Prime Minister, because the Honorable Prime Minister said something in March, and I said it too at that time, about the wearing of masks. And what the member for Barataria San Juan does not appreciate is that as we get experience with a new novel virus, what we thought then, as said by the CDC, as said by WHO, about wearing of masks, we have to alter our views. It's the same way that the UNC is changing their position on sunshine and the virus. You have changed your position. So if you change your position, that back then, the virus was being controlled not because of the Ministry of Health. I remember that video under a tent with rain falling, saying it had nothing to do with the Ministry of Health, but it had to do with sunshine. As you know, sunshine kills the virus, quote, unquote. Right? So we have to change our thinking as the thing evolves. What we did not know then was the extent of transmissibility. What we know now is that the thing is very transmissible. What we did not know then was the fact about asymptomatic spread and pre-symptomatic spread. But we know that now. So we must change our protocols and our thinking. Madam Speaker, the Health and Metrics and Evidence Division states that if we wear masks on a global level, we could save about 33,000 lives around the world. 33,000 lives. We could save it. And that is what we are here about today. So the evolution of the pandemic from December 2019, where the strange pneumonia started to show up, to when we first closed our borders to prevent the virus coming in, to what we know about pre-symptomatic spread, asymptomatic spread, tells us now, with 8 months of experience only, that the barrier methods such as masks and shields, together with other public health measures, is the way to go. Is the way to go. The Mayo Clinic, and this is why we have to change our thinking. The Mayo Clinic has said, yes, the guidelines are shifting. The CDC had to roll back its original guidelines on mask wearing. WHO had to roll back the original guidelines on mask wearing. We have to be flexible and nimble and can't be shackled by the thinking of just 6 months ago. Because 6 months ago, we did not know that young people in their 20s and 30s could die of blood clots. We know that now. So mask wearing is important. 6 months ago, we did not know that babies will be so badly affected. We know that now. So parents have to wear masks. That is what we're about. Madam Speaker, the issue of masks goes like this. If I cough, the studies show, and everybody knows, the droplets can carry for about 9-10 feet. As you start to wear different types of masks, single ply, double ply, that distance is cut down significantly. So spread, and the amount of people in that radius that you are in fact, protected. So the wearing of masks, the time is now, the time is here. But I am not surprised by the giggles coming from opposite. I'm really not surprised. Saddened, yes, but not surprised. All the evidence points to the fact that as countries try to reopen their economy, because no country can shut down forever, the wearing of masks and the public health measures become important. Madam Speaker, masks become more important the closer you are to each other. I remember answering a question in this parliament very early in the pandemic from the Honorable Ramona RAMNATH, somebody that everybody should listen to these days, asking me about masks. And I did say that close personal contact was defined as being within 3 to 6 feet of someone for 15 minutes or more. If you do that, your chances of contracting the coronavirus are higher. Because in that 15 minutes, you are speaking. The evidence now, and this is why you have to change your thinking and be agile in your thinking. The evidence now, as opposed to the evidence then was focusing on large droplets. We were focusing on that. The evidence now, in the past 2 months, now focuses on small droplets. And what the evidence is saying is that in an environment, especially a closed environment, an air-conditioned environment where you don't have air transfer and air exchange, your chances of contracting COVID with small droplets increases significantly because these small droplets tend to hang in the air, as opposed to larger droplets which tend to sink. So the changing has, the evidence has changed. And that is why we have to change our stance on the issue of masks. Because we have to protect not only against what we knew about large droplets, because we are putting up barriers in our faces, whether it's a shield or a mask, to prevent those droplets from getting into your body orifices, whether it's your eyes, whether it's your nose, whether it's your mouth. And that is what the masks and shields protect against. Also, when we wear these masks in public domain.
Honourable Member for St. Joseph, while I know that you have been answering something that was said, and I have allowed a certain amount of discussion on masks, not just because it's relevant, but it was alluded to that this piece of legislation is the basis for something else to come. I really would not want to turn this debate into either a mask debate, because the Attorney General is very clear. This piece of legislation is not about masks.
Thank you.
So please.
So I leave that. So what we are trying to do now is to find the legislative mechanism to introduce the wearing of masks via a fixed penalty system, because the prior mechanism did not allow for that. So I am grateful for the opportunity to come to the Parliament as the Minister of Health to support the Honourable Attorney General in his efforts to find the legislative fix to make the wearing of masks, the wearing of shields by a fixed penalty system mandatory in Trinidad and Tobago. It will undoubtedly save lives and help us to adjust to a new normal in a very significant way. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for recognizing me, as I wish to contribute to the debate currently before the House. Madam Speaker, before I go through and go forward with respect to my substantive points on the bill before us, I too would like to take the opportunity to offer my sincere thanks to the people of Princestown for reposing their confidence in me overwhelmingly by ensuring that I returned as their Member of Parliament despite the nasty tricks perpetrated by those opposite. The people of Princestown stood resilient, strong in their support for myself and the United National Congress, and I wish to thank them. I also wish to thank the member for Siparia for also placing her trust and confidence in returning me as a candidate for the United National Congress in Princestown. Madam Speaker, I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate all my colleagues on both sides of the House for
being elected, especially the new ones, especially the new faces as we look around this August chamber. There is great hope for Trinidad and Tobago as we see many more young persons. The last Parliament, the 11th Parliament, I used to pride myself as the youngest member. I've now handed over the baton to the member for Barataria San Juan and the member for Shogunas East. Madam Speaker, unlike the Minister of Health, right off the bat, I would like to share with you the clauses that we are particularly concerned about, but are not limited to in terms of that concern. And that will be clause 105C1 and 105A 6 and 7. Madam Speaker, before I make my points with respect to 105C1, 105A 6 and 7, I would like to spend just a few minutes responding to some of the things that were said by the Minister of Health. Madam Speaker, without any disrespect, clearly when I listened to the Minister of Health, it reminded me of a David Rudder's Calypso, where it said, this is not a fetting here, it is madness. You see, Madam Speaker, for a moment, I couldn't tell, and the Minister himself probably couldn't tell if he was coming or if he was going. Because this is the same Minister who advised a few months ago that Trinidad and Tobago will not, and I repeat, the Minister said, we will not experience a COVID-19 explosion. Today, months later, after the horse has already bolted from the stable, we are here cleaning up the mess that was left by this administration. Madam Speaker, the Honourable Minister of Health spoke about CDC and CARPA, and I think the country has gotten so accustomed to hearing those terms on a daily basis that they repeat them before it even comes out of the mouth of the Honourable Minister. The point is, Madam Speaker, is that while the Minister sought to appropriate blame to the CDC and the WHO in terms of moving from where we were in November of last year to where we are today, we were always told that this virus will be mutating. We were always told that there were different strains of the virus, and therefore the mechanisms that would have to be put in place in terms of addressing the serious concerns, the health challenges, will have to be updated. But Madam Speaker, from earlier clock, the World Health Organization in January indicated that they were in support of mandatory mask wearing. So for the Minister of Health to come and say that he was listening to what CDC had to say and what this organization had to say, it was pure hypocrisy, because the Honourable Minister knew very well that the position of the World Health Organization was strong and resolute since January 2020. Madam Speaker, 105C1 deals with the challenges specifically as it relates to the payment methods. Now, the Honourable Attorney General indicated that this really has to do with the fixed penalties. And we understand that, we understand the regulations are yet to come. But, Madam Speaker, when I looked at 105C1 and I saw the challenges, especially in shared Commonwealth jurisdictions, especially when you look at what occurred in the United Kingdom and what occurred in Australia with respect to their payment methods, there were serious challenges, and the member for Barataria San Juan spoke about some of those challenges in terms of bogging the court system down, in terms of getting persons to go there to pay the fines, in terms of also making other areas, in terms of public offices, in terms of private sector, opening up spaces to have these payments be made in a more practical way while observing COVID-19 regulations. Madam Speaker, I was driving here earlier today and I saw several government offices where persons were lined up outside, and there were hundreds in some instances. People were wearing masks, but there was no social distancing. And Madam Speaker, that could very well be the situation when you take into consideration clause 105C1, which deals with the payment methods. I know the Honourable Attorney General, the member for San Fernando West, has spoken about the court pay system and that sort of a thing. But Madam Speaker, we live in Trinidad and Tobago where we understand that the reality is far different. And separate and apart from what is contained in this clause 105C1,
one of the challenges will also be implementation. So it is not just passing the legislation today, going through the clauses, anticipating regulations, but it also has to do with enforcement. And I think that is the part where Trinidad and Tobago is most concerned about. Because, Madam, with all due respect, when we speak about clause 105C1 and we speak about 105A6 and 7, we go into the technical jargon of the bill. The average man and woman outside there do not understand. They do not understand because the thing about it is that it is left up to us, their representatives, to put it in simple language so that they are able to follow. I am hoping that if we are keeping with the provisions in 105C1, that there will be a public awareness campaign. And the thing about it, we just cannot pass the legislation today, still anticipating regulations, and there's no public awareness campaign. So therefore, you are legislating, providing fines, hefty fines that it is, without informing the population. And I think that will be a serious challenge. When you look at the way in which the United Kingdom passed their mandatory mask legislation, Madam Speaker, they were very specific from day one. They wanted to know what a face covering is. It was clearly defined. There was no ambiguity in the law. And while the Attorney General may say it will come in the regulations, and I know we are not dealing with the regulations right now, we are dealing with the amendment to the public health ordinance with respect to the fixed penalties. These are some of the things that should have been dealt with in the debate, so it goes hand in hand. That there's no room for ambiguity from day one. Because what is going to happen is that you will see over the weekend, Madam Speaker, you will have several commentators on those talk shows, articles in the newspaper, speculating and creating confusion in the minds of our citizens. The UK, as I said, when they identify the method that they will use, as we are identifying in terms of our payments, 105C1, when they look at their proposed sections in 105A6 and 7, it says this clause goes a step further than the UK mandatory mask regulation in that it allows for recourse to the court, even when the person opts to pay the fixed penalty within the stipulated 14-day period. This by no means suggests that paying the ticket is a necessary precondition to challenge the FPN, which is the fixed penalties, which will allow anyone who has not paid to appear before the court and challenge those fixed penalties. So, Madam Speaker, my point is it must go hand in hand. And that is what the UK in particular did in terms of identifying their penalties, the systems for payment, but they also gave from day one in passing their law when it was that you had to wear a face covering, which was mandatory, what is considered a mandatory face covering, when you do not need to wear face covering, the reason for using face coverings, how to wear face covering, buying and selling of face coverings, maintaining and disposing of face coverings. Madam Speaker, one of the things that I'd also like for the Honourable Attorney General to provide clarity for is in the United Kingdom, in their legislation for the exemptions, they will now issue, once you qualify for those exemptions, they will now issue something called an exemption card that you will have on your person, that should an officer try to impose a fine on you, having committed an offense, you are then able to produce and say, well, no, I am exempted from it. We need to know what is the process going forward with respect to that, because there are different categories of persons in this country who are particularly concerned. Madam Speaker, when you look at the Australian legislation, especially because they're broken up in provinces in Australia, some of the provinces differ from one to the other. Canberra, in particular, Canberra has looked at between the ages of 10 to 12 years old. Now, the law as it stands is at 12 years old, but they are looking at from 10 years old. So they're looking at amending it. A 12-year-old and up will be required to wear a mask. Now, again, these are the challenges that we face without having the regulations before us. So these were some of the areas that I wanted to look at in particular. I know my colleague for the constituency of Faizabad in particular dealt with the issue of the breakdown, and the Honourable Attorney General spoke to it with respect to our circumstance here in Trinidad and Tobago and what the Cabinet and the government is proposing. And there's a tiered system in terms of the first offense, the second offense, and the third offense. Now, Honorable Attorney General, when you look at some of these Commonwealth jurisdictions, Australia in particular, the UK in particular, the fines are quite comparable in terms of what you are proposing. And while that may be good for the first, second, and third offenses as it relates to what we have seen in the other jurisdictions and what you're proposing here, again, we would like to have some clarity as you wind up in terms of whether or not there will be disparity. And you did indicate that there will be some disparity in terms of a magistrate imposing these fines and fixed penalties. Madam Speaker, one other point before I wrap up is the issue of, again, Clause 105C1, which deals with the payment methods. And what we have also seen in other Commonwealth jurisdictions, in particular Australia, is that employers themselves have had penalties imposed on them, that if you go into a private sector workplace and they are discouraging their employees from wearing these face masks because it's not in the definition section of a public space, that meaning a public or government office, and they have the jurisdiction over their private offices, that employers too can be imposed with these fixed penalties. So, Madam Speaker, I think this legislation being brought here today, while the intention may be good in some ways, there's a lot more questions than answers, and this has become a characteristic of this particular administration, in that we tend to rush the legislation, and then what happens is that 2 or 3 days later they realize they forgot this, they forgot that, they did not address this, they did not address that, and hurriedly back we come back with a miscellaneous provision bill. Madam Speaker, in the last Parliament, the most amount of bills this administration probably passed were miscellaneous provision bills. And one of the rationales that was provided by the AG at that time was that, we wanted to get things done quickly and so on. And while that may be a good thing, the thing about it, at this point in time, you have now started the 12th Parliament. You will have 5 sessions should you hold on in the 5 years, which we doubt very much, the rate that you're going from day one. But, Madam Speaker, I am saying to the government today, pace yourself so that the population understands where you want to take them to. They understand what are the challenges that we are facing, because you were the very ones who told them that you are #1 according to Oxford University, not knowing that was the greatest hoax that you ever perpetrated on the people of Trinidad and Tobago in a global pandemic. Today, Madam Speaker, when the real evidence comes out, Trinidad and Tobago is ranked at number 163. And that is the continued deception of this government. And that is why, while we want to support good measures that will bring about relief and put our citizens in a safe space, Madam Speaker, we have learned from the past that we cannot trust this government, and therefore that is why we would like our questions to be answered, but also we'd like to know in terms of when we can expect the regulations. So with those words, Madam Speaker, I thank you.
Member Somiaro.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much, AG. Madam Speaker, thank you very much for acknowledging me to join this debate today as we look at an act to amend the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, to make provision for fixed penalties and fixed penalty notices for offences under the Public Health Ordinance. Madam Speaker, before I get into my very short contribution today, I also like to offer my congratulations to all my colleagues here on both sides. Welcome everybody to the 12th Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam Speaker, I also welcome you back to the chair as well. Madam Speaker, the Attorney General presented a very important piece of legislation here today. And by all accounts, from all my colleagues who have spoken before, there is widespread support for very important pieces of legislation, especially this one, in terms of controlling this pandemic that has been affecting the entire world, and so far it's been getting worse here in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to just present a position that how did we get here? It is a bit fascinating and somewhat disturbing at times, Madam Speaker, that this very same government said that COVID-19, sometime back in February, as alluded to by my colleague from Princestown, that it would not be a threat to Trinidad and Tobago. And we are here today to introduce some far-reaching and I would say some historic legislation to make this mask wearing mandatory. And we're bringing components of the public health ordinance to make that happen. Madam Speaker, it was this very same Minister of Health who was on television who said that the chances of Trinidad and Tobago getting these infections were remote to non-existent. And he added, if we're going to get it, it's going to be in individual cases. If we get it, Madam Speaker, over successive weeks, this very same minister continued, in my respectful view, to underplay the growing international pandemic, and as a result, would have failed to prepare this country for the eventual rate of the infections that we are seeing today. Madam Speaker, the fact is that Trinidad and Tobago has descended from a seemingly safe position in February to what we have now, seeing widespread community infections. I see we had 2 additional deaths today. We've had several business closures, and as we are here today in this Parliament to bring regulations to look at mandatory mask wearing and penalties for not doing so. And one can only assume, Madam Speaker, it is because of, I would say, gross ineptitude in the management of this medical issue and the deliberate downplaying of the problem for short-term gains by this administration, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
please. Member for Miharu, I'll allow you to proceed, but just be careful.
Sure. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, against this backdrop, the legislation to penalize our citizens for not wearing masks, we got to this point today because I feel that there's a lack of credibility that the government has not been able to encourage citizens to act on their own to wear masks. And the response that I have been getting from my constituents, Madam Speaker, is that sometimes they don't believe what is being said on the television. The communication has been poor. And because of that, the citizens have not taken it upon themselves to see the benefit of wearing the mask. And we have gotten to the point today that we have to come and bring legislation to force our citizens now to wear these masks for their own good. Of critical relevance, Madam Speaker, I think this credibility gap, they have not been able to persuade our citizens that it is important that we take this most effective action without having to legislate behavior. And I always have a problem when we as a parliament try to legislate behavior. Madam Speaker, any government that has convinced its electorate that it has the moral standing to give instructions for the benefit and the good of the people, I don't think if this government was successful at doing that, we may not have to be here trying to legislate behaviors, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in my research, I have counted over 50 jurisdictions that have overcome the worst of this crisis without introducing legislation that gives punitive consequences like we're in Marx. So those jurisdictions, those countries, they would have had a successful campaign in terms of convincing the public on their behavior and how not to end up in the position that we in Trinidad and Tobago find ourselves in today. Madam Speaker, one of the things that I saw that happen in England was that the English government, they introduced this mandatory mask law sometime in mid-July, and they ran into opposition from both their medical fraternity and their law enforcement officials as well. And clearly in those jurisdictions, those two groups, they are not their political opposition, but senior officials from the Center for Disease and Prevention Control and the Metropolitan Police Federation, they both separately warned the government that the law was unenforceable in England. A gentleman by the name of Dr. Agorista Baca, who is a chief expert at the center, said persuasion would have been more effective than bringing this mandatory law. Ken Marsh, who is the head of their police federation, also said that enforcing the law would be almost impossible. Dr. Baca closed his contribution, Madam Speaker, when he said, and if I can quote him, "In public health, we don't like much the mandatory stuff. We want to persuade people to do something to change their behavior." So, Madam Speaker, when you make something mandatory, you need to have a way to enforce it, what we're doing here today. And if we are unsuccessful with this piece of legislation, Madam Speaker, clearly we are going to be ridiculed by the public, and we will not have the outcome that we would like to have based on this legislation. And those were the expert words of both their medical fraternity and their legal fraternity, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I must admit that the government has advised the public on the essential need to wear the mask and all the relevant medical precautions that must be taken. But the fact is that we are here again shows the failure of that campaign. And I would like to make a couple suggestions, Madam Speaker, that not only should the government look at making this mask law compulsory, but the government must redouble its public awareness campaign on mask wearing. I think although we put the legislation here today, the public awareness must increase. They must also speak about the importance of the physical distancing, the respiratory etiquette, hand hygiene, and obviously not touching your face, your nose, and your mouth, and so on. So besides the legislation, I think the failure of the campaign in the past, we are looking to save lives in this country, Madam Speaker. So I'm asking the government to get out there and reinforce and re-energize its public awareness campaign. If the initial education crusade was not successful, the common sense would dictate that the campaign be remodeled and improved. Madam Speaker, citizens must also be assured that while wearing the mask may be uncomfortable, for most people, there are no medical side effects and a lot more benefits at the end of the day. So a bit of the discomfort, I know I myself have a bit of discomfort being a glasses wearer, spectacle wearer. I get fogged out at times, and that causes a bit of problems, more so when you're out in the public, and that may cause people to get a bit of discomfort. Again, the public awareness is important, so we encourage more citizens to continue using the mask. Madam Speaker, if you just allow me to mention one or two exemptions that I would like the Attorney General to consider
in his wind-up. Again, we all did a bit of research in terms of preparing for this bill, and in several jurisdictions, I highlighted a few areas that it's important that we look at for exemptions. Children younger than 2 years old, anyone who has trouble breathing, anyone who would need assistance in terms of who are wheelchair bound and so on. Madam Speaker, there is an article that I encountered published on the 10th of July 2020 entitled Mass Exemptions During the COVID-19 Pandemic in New Frontier for Clinicians. The author is Dr. Michael Raz, and he had to say, and I quote him, "Some individuals, particularly children with sensory processing disorders, may be unable to tolerate masks. Facial deformities that are incompatible with masking are an additional category of exemption to consider." The CDC as well, Madam Speaker, they too said that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, mental health conditions, and other sensory sensitivities, such as autism spectrum disorder, wearing masks could create some distress. So nowhere in the bill, and perhaps it may come later in terms of exemptions, I would be very much interested to see what the exemptions are, because I believe we must have some exemptions to the rule in this particular case. Madam Speaker, overall the legislation appears to me, from listening to my colleagues who have spoken before, it's not well thought out, and it should be reconsidered a bit in terms of some amendments. The provisions are not in line with most countries that are battling COVID-19. I do not think that the government has the ability to right a wrong in its governance by punitive measures against a society that is already suffering from a lot of medical setbacks, job losses, business closures, and so on. Madam Speaker, there are just two questions on the bill itself that I would like to ask before wrapping up. Attorney General, section under 3, where you are changing the ceiling from 50,000 to 250,000, if you can give me an example in your wind-up as to what type of violation would attract a fine or a ticketable fine at $250,000, I'd be interested in finding out what type of violation would attract that. And if I turn to 105B, particulars to be specified in a fixed penalty notice, I am looking at A, B, C, D, E, and F as to what is the police officer going to put on this fixed penalty notice. And perhaps I've never received a ticket, a driving ticket either, Madam Speaker, so I don't know what the ticket looks like. But nowhere here I'm seeing the person's name. Where do you insert the person's name who's getting the ticket? And I think the member for Faizabad alluded to that. If you were to stop somebody, the officer stops somebody on the road because they're not wearing the mask, and you ask him your name, and he says, well, my name is Rushton Pare. How do you verify that if he doesn't have an ID? What name are you going to put on the ticket for him to go and pay? So I know there is the police can take you to the station and verify your ID and so on, but that in itself is some administrative overhead. So perhaps if a little explanation as to how you'd be able to properly identify this person receiving the fixed penalty notice without having them have an ID on them, I'd be interested to find out that. So, Madam Speaker, those were a few of the areas that I had some concerns with, and some clarity by the Attorney General would be welcome. And before I wrap up, I just want to thank the constituents of Mayaro who, through their overwhelming support again behind me for a second term. I'd like to thank the honorable political leader, the member for Superior, for putting her trust and faith in me for a second time to bring the constituency of Mayaro back to the United National Congress. And I want to wish all my colleagues on both sides a very successful term in this upcoming parliamentary term. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Member for St. Anne's North, for the Spain North, St. Anne's West.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, first of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the constituents in Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, who saw it fit to return me to this August Hall to continue making the contributions on their behalves also to the People's National Movement for selecting me as their candidate for Port of Spain North St. Anne's West. Madam Speaker, I have to start by saying that I had hoped that this term in Parliament would be somewhat different, and that we would all come here with renewed responsibility and renewed thought patterns, that we would just continue to, that we would do what was best for Trinidad and Tobago. I start by saying that in my respectful view, I don't think that the issue of COVID and how we deal with COVID as a country should be politicized in the manner that I've heard it here today. I'd like to say that with respect to COVID, if it hasn't been learned as yet by those on the other side, thank you very much. I'd like to say that if it hasn't been learned by some in this chamber as yet, COVID does not care about your race, about what creed, your religion, how much money you do or you don't have, where you've come from, what sex you are, your age, or anything like that. That point seems to be missed. The point is, and another point that I'd like to make, Madam Speaker, is this issue of COVID, this pandemic, this virus, is only 8 months old. So I've sat here and I've heard persons say that this was said in February, and masks were advised that you shouldn't use masks in February, and now here we are trying to make it mandatory that you wear masks. The world experts that we were all following at the onset of this pandemic globally, the WHO, I recall very, very clearly, early in the life of this virus, the WHO and other persons, other international experts were saying they didn't think the use of masks was going to help prevent the spread of this virus. However, this government, this responsible government, from day one, took the advice of our local health experts, and I'd like to use the opportunity to thank them again for their tireless effort. The Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Hines, Dr. Michelle Trotman, the Minister of Health, and his whole team, whenever we sat and we met on a weekly basis, we listened carefully to their advice. And to their credit, the Trinidad and Tobago public servant experts, the health experts, said very early o'clock to the Minister of Health, the Prime Minister and myself, the use of masks would help in the fight against COVID. And that was taking place in March when we came out and we took the decisions that we did, and we implemented the stay-at-home orders. And the recommendation, I've heard the member from Mayaro talk about persuasion. We went through the stage of persuasion. We are not here today looking to introduce a fixed penalty system because we haven't tried the persuasive attempts, the attempts to persuade the population to do what is right. And I sat here and I listened to some of the contributions, and I thought of irony and a little bit of hypocrisy, because the health experts were telling us from day one, wear your mask. We in this house were mandated to wear masks at all times, very early o'clock, to spread out, have the social distance. We have gone the route of persuasion. We have tried the persuasion. We kept saying that we will continue. We kept asking the health experts, go out there and tell the population the importance of wearing masks, how that can save lives, how it may stop the spread of the virus. And the hypocrisy that I refer to, and the irony, is some of the types of behavior that we, the population, witnessed not too long ago, before August 10th. Certain persons who aspire for leadership in this country never being photographed with a mask on in massive crowds and gatherings, and to have the audacity to come here today and to attack an attempt by a responsible government. And I want to put on record, put it on the Hansard, that we are here today pursuing the mandatory wearing of masks, and I'll get to the fixed penalty system in a short while, because the health experts have asked us for it. The health experts have asked the Minister of Health, the Prime Minister, Minister of National Security, and the Attorney General, please make it mandatory for persons to wear masks. You should wear a muzzle, not a mask. Right? So that is why we're here today. We are not here today because we woke up in the morning.
Poor, please, because talk the members.
I am talking, I am on my legs.
Okay, so can we resume?
You know, it is somewhat offensive to stand there